Welcome to 40K Galaxy, where the grim darkness of the far future comes alive. Here we explore the endless wars, heroic battles, and terrifying horrors of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. From fortress worlds under siege to the depths of the Eye of Terror, we bring the stories, lore, and epic adventures straight to your screen. Ready your bolters, steel your faith, and join us as we witness the Imperium stand against the darkness. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because in the 41st millennium, the Emperor protects those who are vigilant.
Every day in the Imperium of Man, a billion prayers rise to the Golden Throne. Every day, a billion more souls vanish into the machinery of faith and war. And every day, somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, an Inquisitor writes a name in a data slate that will never be erased. Today, that name might be yours. The Inquisition doesn't knock. They don't announce themselves with warrants or legal procedures. They simply arrive, and when they do, your life, everything you've built, everyone you've loved, every truth you've held sacred, becomes nothing more than evidence in a case that was probably decided before you even became a suspect. If you crave more tales from the grim darkness of the far future, hit that subscribe button now. The Emperor protects those who stay vigilant. And you'll need that protection after what I'm about to show you. Castellan Sergeant Davos Kern didn't know he was being investigated. He was a loyal servant of the Emperor, 23 years in the Astra Militarum, veteran of the Damocles Gulf Campaign, decorated twice for valor under fire. He commanded 3rd Platoon, Cadian 8th Regiment Reserves, stationed on the agri-world of Verdant 3. His record was immaculate. His faith was unquestionable. His daily routine was documented, predictable, unremarkable. None of that mattered. The investigation had begun 6 weeks earlier, triggered not by anything Kern had done, but by something a logistics servitor had detected in the regiment's supply manifests. A pattern. An irregularity so small that 99.9% of Imperial bureaucracy would have dismissed it as clerical error. But the servitor's cogitator brain, running perpetual analysis algorithms, flagged it, forwarded it, and somewhere in the vast data networks that bound the Imperium together, that flag reached an inquisitorial agent embedded in the Munitorum. The irregularity was this: 17 requisition forms for LHO sticks had been filed by Kern's platoon over the past 8 months. The forms were proper, the quantities were reasonable, the authorization codes were valid. But the handwriting, analyzed by cognition pattern recognition servitors, showed microscopic variations that suggested the forms had been filled out by different people, all attempting to mimic Kern's signature. Most investigators would have assumed fraud, soldiers stealing supplies and forging documents. A matter for the commissariat at most. Oz Inquisitor Felicia Vance saw something else entirely. Vance was Ordo Hereticus, a witch hunter with 37 years of service and a mind trained to see patterns in chaos. She'd broken 73 cults, purged 41 cells of sedition, and authorized the execution of over 2,000 souls who'd strayed from the Emperor's light. She knew that sometimes the smallest irregularity was the first thread you pulled to unravel an entire tapestry of corruption. Forged requisition forms meant conspiracy. Conspiracy meant multiple individuals working in coordination. Coordination meant organization. Organization meant purpose. And purpose, in the context of deviation from Imperial procedure, meant potential heresy. Vance deployed to Verdant 3 without announcement. Her inquisitorial seal granted her access to every record, every surveillance feed, every private communication the planetary government possessed. She didn't start with Kern. She started with everyone who'd ever served in his platoon, everyone who'd requisitioned supplies, everyone who'd had access to his signature stamp. The investigation tree grew like a cancer through the data networks. Vance's team, 3 interrogators, 6 acolytes, 24 stormtroopers, and a sanctioned psyker, worked in absolute secrecy, building a composite picture of Kern's life that was more detailed than his own memories. They knew he woke every day at 0530 hours. They knew he took recaf with 2 measures of saccharin, that he wrote letters to his sister on Cadia every 6th day, that he'd been involved in a romantic relationship with a remembrancer named Elise Moravec 3 years prior, but had ended it when she'd expressed doubt about the necessity of the imperial tithe. They knew about the scar on his left shoulder from an orc choppa, about his fear of enclosed spaces after being buried in a trench collapse on Cronus, about the nightmares he never reported to medical staff. They knew everything except whether he was guilty. That was the thing about inquisitorial investigations. Guilt was assumed until proven otherwise. The question wasn't, did this person commit heresy? The question was, what form does their heresy take, and how far has it spread? Kern first noticed something was wrong when Lieutenant Grades didn't show up for morning muster. Grades was punctual to a fault, the kind of officer who'd rather die than miss a formation. When Kern checked with Regimental HQ, they told him Grades had been reassigned, effective immediately. No explanation. 3 days later, Corporal Hassan vanished. Then Private Yelan. Then Commissar Adjutant Cross, who'd been with the regiment for 15 years and was practically a fixture. Kern started asking questions. That was his second mistake. His first had been existing in proximity to an irregularity that attracted inquisitorial attention. On the morning of the 18th day of Vance's investigation, Kern was conducting routine platoon training when a Valkyrie gunship descended from the clouds like the judgment of the God Emperor made manifest. It landed in the center of the training field, washing exercises in rotor wash and dust. The side doors opened, and stormtroopers emerged in full carapace armor, hellguns raised. Behind them walked Inquisitor Vance, her inquisitorial rosette gleaming on her chest like a third eye that saw through flesh and bone into the soul beneath. Castellan Sergeant Davos Kern, her voice cut through the engine noise with absolute authority. By the power vested in me by the Emperor's Holy Inquisition, you are hereby detained for investigation into suspected heretical activity, conspiracy against the Imperium, and corruption of Imperial resources. You will accompany me. Resistance will be considered proof of guilt and met with immediate execution. Kern's hands didn't move toward his Les pistol. His training was too good for that. He knew what the Inquisition was, knew that arguing was futile, knew that his life, as he'd known it, had just ended. I am loyal to the Emperor, he said, voice steady despite the fear coiling in his gut. Vance's expression didn't change. That, she said, is what we're going to determine. The detention cell aboard Vance's ship, the absolute certainty, was 3 meters by 3 meters of bare rockcrete and steel. No windows, no furniture except a metal slab that served as both seat and bed. A single lumen strip in the ceiling provided cold white light that never dimmed, never flickered, never gave Kern the mercy of darkness to mark the passage of time. He'd been there for what felt like days, could have been hours, could have been weeks. The Inquisition didn't operate on schedules that acknowledged human circadian rhythms or psychological need. Time itself became a weapon, stretching and compressing until Kern couldn't trust his own mind to measure its passage. No one had questioned him yet. That was intentional. The isolation was the first phase of interrogation, the softening process that wore down mental defenses before a single question was ever asked. Kern knew this intellectually. Commissariat training included basic resistance to interrogation, but knowing something and experiencing it were different things entirely. His mind kept circling back to the same questions. What had he done? What had anyone in his platoon done? The requisition forms? That was Hassan's doing. He was almost certain. The corporal had a side business selling Lahostics to other regiments, skimming a few from each shipment. Petty corruption, the kind that happened in every guard regiment across the Imperium. Annoying, against regulations, but hardly heresy. Except the Inquisition didn't distinguish between minor infractions and major corruption. Every violation of Imperial law was a crack in the armor, and a potential entry point for chaos. A stolen Elo stick today could be a summoned demon tomorrow. That was the logic. That was why they burned worlds over suspicions. The door opened without warning. Kern stood immediately, old military reflex, as Inquisitor Vance entered, followed by a woman in the robes of the Ministorum and a man whose augmetic eyes whirred and clicked as they focused on Kern with unnatural precision. "Sit," Vance commanded. Kern sat. Vance remained standing, studying him with the clinical detachment of a biologist examining a specimen. "Do you know why you're here, Castellan Sergeant?" "No, ma'am." Truth, the only weapon he had left. 17 requisition forms, 8 months, 3 different hands attempting to replicate your signature. Explain. Kern's mind raced. Admitting knowledge meant complicity. So denying knowledge meant either stupidity or deliberate ignorance. Both were condemnable. He chose the truth again, because lies would only make it worse. "Corporal Hassan, ma'am. He was running a side trade in El Hostix. I suspected, but hadn't confirmed it. I was planning to handle it internally." "Planning," Vance repeated, her tone suggesting that planning without action was itself a failure. "You allowed corruption to persist in your command for 8 months. You failed to report it through proper channels. You intended to circumvent commissariat authority. Do you understand that these actions constitute dereliction of duty and conspiracy to commit fraud against the Imperium?" "Aye." Kern started, then stopped. There was no right answer. Anything he said would be used to construct a narrative of guilt. The woman in Ministorum robes stepped forward. Her face was kind, maternal even, which somehow made her more terrifying than Vance's cold efficiency. "Sergeant Kern, we're not your enemies. We serve the Emperor, just as you do. But the Imperium faces threats from within and without. Chaos corruption doesn't announce itself with fangs and horns. It begins with small compromises. A forged signature here, a blind eye there. Before you know it, you're kneeling before false idols, and your soul belongs to the ruinous powers." She leaned closer. "We need to know if you've been compromised. If anyone in your platoon has been compromised. Not because we want to punish you, but because we need to stop the infection before it spreads. Do you understand?" Kern understood. Understood that she was offering him a rope that looked like rescue, but was actually a noose. Admit to suspicion. Implicate others. Provide names and details that would expand the investigation like a virus through the regiment. "I haven't been compromised," he said carefully. "My faith in the Emperor is absolute." The augmented man spoke for the first time, his voice buzzing with vox corruption. "Faith is measurable, observable, quantifiable through behavioral analysis and psychometric evaluation. Your statement of faith is noted. Now we will test its validity." He stepped forward, pulling a device from his robes, a handheld unit covered in dials and sensor nodes that glowed with a sickly green light. "This is a purity scanner. It detects trace elements of warp contamination in biological tissue. The process is uncomfortable, but necessary." Kern didn't move as the man pressed the device against his temple. Immediately, pain lanced through his skull like white-hot needles driven directly into his brain. He heard himself scream, distantly, as if the sound was coming from someone else. The device hummed and clicked, recording data that would be analyzed, cross-referenced, used as evidence in a case being built against him one data point at a time. When it finally stopped, Kern slumped forward, gasping. Blood dripped from his nose. His vision swam with afterimages. "Contamination levels within acceptable parameters," the augmented man reported. "No evidence of demonic taint or warp exposure beyond standard background radiation." Vance's expression didn't change. Clean scans meant nothing. Chaos corruption could be psychological, ideological, spiritual. So the absence of physical taint just meant they'd have to dig deeper, ask harder questions, apply more invasive techniques. "Tell me about Private Yelan," Vance said. Kern blinked, trying to focus through the pain. "Yelan? What about him? You recommended him for promotion 6 months ago. On what basis?" "He's a good soldier, reliable, follows orders." He also filed 3 complaints about Commissar Cross in the past year, complaints that were dismissed. Did you know about these complaints? No. Did Yellen ever express anti-commissariat sentiments to you? No. Did he ever question orders, express doubt about Imperial policy, suggest that the Guard's tactics were inefficient or wasteful? Kern hesitated. Every soldier questioned tactics sometimes. It was human nature. But admitting that would be admitting to tolerance of seditious thought. Vance saw the hesitation. Your silence is answer enough. We'll return to this topic. The questioning continued for hours, days. Time lost meaning again as Vance and her team worked through every person Kern had ever served with, every conversation he could remember, every moment of doubt or question or human weakness. They weren't looking for a conspiracy. They were constructing one, piece by piece, using the ordinary friction of military life as evidence of corruption. When they finally left him alone again, Kern sat in the darkness. They'd turned off the lumen strip and understood with terrible clarity that his innocence didn't matter. The Inquisition didn't investigate people to prove them innocent. They investigated to determine what form of guilt applied and what level of purging would be required to cleanse it. Still with us in the darkness? Hit that like button if this tale chills your soul. They came for Kern's sister on the morning of the 5th day. Kern didn't know this was happening. He was 3 decks down in a different interrogation chamber, strapped to a brass chair, while a sanctioned psyker named Valdez prepared to rip through his memories like pages in a book. But while Kern screamed under psychic invasion, stormtroopers were kicking down the door of a hab block on Cadia, dragging a woman named Sarah Kern from her bed while her children watched. Sarah was a seamstress. She'd never fired a weapon, never left Cadia, never done anything except work 14-hour days in a textile manufactory and raised 2 children alone after her husband died in the 13th Black Crusade. Her only connection to the investigation was biological. She shared blood with a man who'd shared command with a corporal who'd forged requisition forms. In the eyes of the Inquisition, that was connection enough. This is what people don't understand about inquisitorial investigations. They don't stop with the suspect. They metastasize, spreading through every relationship, every connection, every thread of association until entire communities are consumed. Your guilt becomes their guilt. Your suspicion becomes their damnation. Vance's team had already detained 47 people. Lieutenant Grades was in a cell 2 doors down from Kern, undergoing enhanced interrogation after his purity scans showed trace warp exposure, the result of serving on a world with elevated background radiation. But the Inquisition didn't believe in coincidence. So Corporal Hassan had broken under questioning and confessed to the El Hostik scheme, then confessed to a dozen other minor infractions, then started inventing crimes he hadn't committed just to make the pain stop. Private Yellen hadn't broken. He'd maintained his innocence through 6 sessions of interrogation, through the purity scanner, through sleep deprivation and sensory manipulation. His mind was strong. His faith was genuine. None of that saved him when Vance's psyker detected a fragment of doubt buried in his subconscious. A moment 3 years ago when he'd wondered, just for a second, if the Emperor truly watched over them, or if it was all just stories told to keep soldiers obedient. One moment of doubt, 3 years ago, buried so deep that Yellen himself had forgotten it. The Inquisition remembered everything. Yellen was sent to a Penal Legion. His family was marked with a red seal in the planetary records, the taint of association. His children would never be allowed to serve in the Guard, hold government positions, or marry into families of good standing. 3 generations of punishment for one man's fleeting thought. Back in the interrogation chamber, Kern felt Valdez's psychic touch like ice water flooding his brain. The psyker was sanctioned, his powers bound and controlled by the Imperium, his third eye sealed with a brass plate inscribed with prayers of warding. But sanctioned didn't mean safe, didn't mean gentle. "Relax your mind, Sergeant," Valdez whispered, his voice seeming to come from inside Kern's own skull. "Resistance only makes this more painful." Kern tried to relax. tried to let the psyker in rather than fighting the invasion. But his mind rebelled instinctively, throwing up walls and barriers, protecting memories that weren't even relevant to the investigation. Childhood moments, private thoughts, the time he'd failed to save a squad mate, the guilt, the shame, the very human imperfection that made him vulnerable. Valdez pushed through those walls like they were paper. Kern experienced his own life in reverse, memories pulled to the surface and examined with clinical precision. Every conversation with Hassan replayed in perfect detail. Every interaction with Yellen analyzed for hidden meaning. Every moment of doubt or frustration or anger cataloged as potential evidence of corruption. The psyker found the memory of Elise Moravec, the remembrancer who'd expressed doubt about the Imperial tithe. Kern had ended the relationship immediately. Yai reported her concerns through proper channels. He'd done everything right, but the memory of her words remained. And in that memory, for just a fraction of a second, Kern had wondered if she was right. If the Imperium did demand too much from its citizens, if the endless grinding war was sustainable, or just a slow march toward extinction. He'd crushed the thought immediately, had reaffirmed his faith, had never entertained the notion again. But the thought had existed. For one terrible moment, it had been real. Valdez extracted it like a surgeon removing a tumor. When the psyker finally withdrew, Kern was shaking, tears streaming down his face, his mind feeling violated in ways that physical torture could never match. Vance stood watching from the corner, her expression unreadable. 6 years ago, she said quietly, "You questioned the Imperial tithe." "I didn't," Kern gasped. "It was just a thought. 1 second. I rejected it immediately." "But you had the thought." "That thought came from somewhere, Sergeant. Thoughts don't spontaneously generate. They're planted, nurtured, grown from seeds of corruption." "No," Kern said desperately. "It was human doubt, nothing more. I'm loyal. I've served for 23 years. I've bled for the Emperor." "Loyalty measured in time is meaningless," Vance replied. "Chaos corruption can gestate for decades before manifesting. Your service record is commendable, but service doesn't grant immunity to investigation. It doesn't prove purity. If anything, it makes you more dangerous. A corrupted officer has authority, influence, the power to spread taint through entire regiments." She stepped closer, her voice dropping. "Here's what I see, Sergeant. A conspiracy involving forged documents, multiple soldiers demonstrating patterns of deviant thought, a commanding officer who tolerated corruption, questioned Imperial policy, and maintained contact with a known subversive element. The evidence constructs a narrative of systematic moral decay within your entire command structure." "That's not." Kern started, but Vance cut him off. "I don't care what you think it is. I care what the evidence shows. And the evidence shows a platoon that requires purging." The word hit Kern like a physical blow. Purging. Not just execution. Total erasure. Everyone he'd commanded. Everyone who'd served alongside him. Their families. Their friends. Entire bloodlines marked for termination to ensure the corruption didn't spread. "They're innocent," Kern said, not hearing the desperation in his own voice. "Most of them have never even had a suspicious thought. You can't punish them for my failures." Vance's expression finally shifted, not to sympathy, but to something almost like pity. "I can't afford to take that risk. None of us can. The Imperium survives because we cut away infection before it spreads. Better to destroy 100 innocent people than let one heretic escape to corrupt thousands. That's not cruelty, Sergeant. That's mathematics." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Your sister is in custody. Her children are in protective quarantine. Your former romantic partner was found dead in her hablock 3 days ago. Suicide officially, though she was under inquisitorial surveillance. Everyone you've ever known is being examined. And if I find one more thread of corruption, say one more moment of doubt, one more instance of deviation." She didn't finish, didn't need to. The threat was clear. Kern sat alone in the interrogation chamber, the full weight of what was happening crashing down on him. They weren't investigating a crime. They were dismantling his entire existence, person by person, relationship by relationship, until nothing remained except evidence in a case file that would be sealed and forgotten. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. The tribunal convened on the 8th day, though calling it a tribunal suggested something resembling justice. What Kern faced was formality wrapped around a conclusion already reached, a legal framework constructed to legitimize decisions made before he'd ever been detained. The chamber was sparse and cold, a vaulted room of dark stone with the inquisitorial seal carved into the floor, a two-headed eagle clutching a skull in its talons. Vance sat at the center of a raised dais, flanked by 2 other inquisitors who'd reviewed the case files remotely. To her left sat Inquisitor Mordant of the Ordo Xenos, a scarred man whose augmetic jaw clicked when he spoke. To her right was Inquisitor Severina of the Ordo Hereticus, a woman whose pale eyes seemed to look through Kern rather than at him. Kern stood in the center of the room, wrists bound with magna shackles, 2 stormtroopers at his back. He hadn't been allowed to clean himself, hadn't been given fresh clothing. The blood from his nose, courtesy of the purity scanner, had dried in dark streaks down his face. He looked exactly like what the Inquisition wanted the tribunal to see. Broken, dirty, guilty. Castellan Sergeant Devos Kern, Vance began, her voice echoing off stone walls. You stand accused of dereliction of duty, conspiracy to defraud the Imperium, tolerance of heretical thought, and corruption of Imperial resources. How do you answer these charges? There was no option to plead innocent. The Inquisition didn't work that way. Kern had learned this over 8 days of interrogation, isolation, and psychic invasion. His only choice was how thoroughly he condemned himself. I served loyally, Kern said, his voice hoarse from screaming. I made mistakes. I should have reported Hassan sooner. I should have been more vigilant. But I never betrayed the Emperor. I never consorted with chaos. I never. You questioned the Imperial tithe, Severina interrupted, her voice like ice scraping stone. In your own mind, in a moment you thought private, you doubted the wisdom of the administratum. That doubt is heresy, Sergeant. Thought is the seed of action. Today you question the tithe. Tomorrow you refuse to pay it. Next year you're leading a rebellion. We've seen this pattern 1,000 times across 1,000 worlds. It was one thought, Kern said desperately. 6 years ago. I rejected it immediately. I've never acted on it. I've tithed everything required. I've encouraged my soldiers to... Your soldiers, Mordant said, leaning forward. Let's discuss them. Corporal Hassan, fraud and theft. Private Yellen, seditious doubt regarding commissariat authority. Lieutenant Grades, warp exposure, possibly compromised. 4 other members of your command showing psychological markers consistent with early-stage corruption. This isn't coincidence, Sergeant. This is pattern. This is systematic failure of leadership creating an environment where heresy flourishes. Kern wanted to argue, wanted to point out that Hassan's scheme was personal greed, that Yelane's complaint was legitimate concern about officer competence, that Grade's warp exposure was environmental contamination from a previous deployment. But he'd learned that explanations were just confessions in disguise. Every justification gave the Inquisition more material to work with, more threads to pull until the entire tapestry of his life unraveled. The evidence speaks clearly, Vance said, tapping a data slate. 47 individuals detained, 31 showing markers of ideological deviation, 12 with trace warp exposure, 7 with documented instances of questioning Imperial authority. The rot in your command runs deep, Sergeant, deeper than you apparently realized, which speaks to either incompetence or complicity. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. Incompetence of this magnitude is itself heresy. A commander who cannot recognize corruption in his own ranks is a liability the Imperium cannot afford. And complicity. She left the sentence unfinished. Severina took over. We've also examined your sister, Sarah Kern, seamstress, resident of Kasr on Cadia, 2 children. Unremarkable life. But in her correspondence with you, we found something interesting. She activated a holoprojector. Letters materialized in the air, years of messages between Kern and his sister, innocent conversations about family and life, and the mundane details of existence. Severina highlighted specific passages. Here, the manufactorum demands so much, I barely see the children anymore. A complaint about labor conditions. Here, they say the war on Cronus goes well, but the casualty lists suggest otherwise. Questioning official Imperial reports. Here, sometimes I wonder if there will ever be peace, or if this is all there is. Doubt about the Imperium's eternal struggle. Do you see the pattern, Sergeant? Kern stared at the letters, his stomach dropping. They were just words. Human exhaustion and worry translated into text. His sister worked 14-hour shifts and missed her children. That wasn't heresy, that was reality. But through the lens of inquisitorial scrutiny, reality itself became evidence of corruption. She's innocent, Kern said, his voice breaking. She's never done anything except work and raise her family. You can't punish her for being tired, for being human. Being human is not an excuse for deviation, Mordant said flatly. The Emperor demands perfection. Anything less creates opportunities for the enemy. Your sister's complaints about labor conditions suggest susceptibility to seditious ideology. Her questioning of casualty reports suggests lack of faith in Imperial command. Her doubt about eternal war suggests misunderstanding of the Imperium's sacred purpose. She's a seamstress, Kern shouted, finally breaking. She doesn't understand grand strategy or Imperial policy. She's just trying to survive in a galaxy that grinds people to dust. That's not heresy. That's not corruption. That's just human beings trying to endure. The chamber fell silent. Kern realized what he'd done. He'd admitted that the Imperium ground people to dust. He'd expressed sympathy for complaint and doubt. He'd prioritized human suffering over Imperial necessity. He'd confessed. Vance leaned back, something that might have been satisfaction flickering across her face. Thank you, Sergeant. You've just articulated the core of your corruption. You prioritize individual human experience over collective Imperial survival. You see suffering and feel sympathy, rather than recognizing it as necessary sacrifice. You value personal relationships over objective duty. She stood, her inquisitorial rosette catching the light. These are the thoughts that lead to heresy. These are the weaknesses that chaos exploits. You don't need to worship the dark gods to serve them, Sergeant. You just need to value the wrong things, to prioritize mercy over necessity, to question whether the suffering is worth it. Severina and Mordant both nodded. The verdict was unanimous before it was even spoken. Castellan Sergeant Davos Kern, Vance said formally, this tribunal finds you guilty of ideological corruption, dereliction of duty, and systematic failure of Imperial loyalty. Your command structure is compromised. Your personal relationships demonstrate seditious tendencies. Your psychological profile indicates susceptibility to chaos influence. She paused, letting each word land like a hammer blow. Ciodi's sentence will be rendered after final consultation regarding the scope of purge required to cleanse this corruption. You will be returned to detention pending execution of judgment. Kern didn't fight as the stormtroopers grabbed his arms. Didn't resist as they dragged him from the chamber. He'd already lost. Had lost the moment the Inquisition wrote his name in their files. The trial was theater, justification after the fact for decisions made in secret by people who saw the entire Imperium as potential infection requiring constant sterilization. As the door sealed behind him, Kern heard Vance speaking to her fellow Inquisitors. I recommend full platoon purge, extended family quarantine for 3 generations, monitoring of all associated bloodlines for signs of inherited corruption, the mathematics of the Inquisition, calculating human lives like numbers on a balance sheet. And Kern's number, along with everyone he'd ever known, had just been marked for subtraction. The tension builds. Subscribe to witness more tales from the Dark Millennium. They didn't execute Kern immediately. The Inquisition never wasted resources when alternatives existed. and a condemned man still had uses before his final absolution. 3 days after the tribunal, stormtroopers dragged Kern from his cell to a cargo bay that had been converted into a mass processing center. 46 other people were already there, everyone detained during Vance's investigation. Lieutenant grades, hollow-eyed and broken. Corporal Hassan, missing 3 fingers from enhanced interrogation. Private Yellen, still defiant despite everything. Tech adepts who'd maintained the regiment's equipment. Administratum clerks who'd processed the forged requisitions. A Vox operator who'd had the misfortune of relaying one of Hassan's messages. And Sarah, Kern's sister, still in her nightclothes, dried tears staining her face, sought her eyes finding his across the crowd with desperate hope that he could somehow fix this, make it stop, protect her the way older brothers were supposed to. Kern looked away. He couldn't protect anyone anymore. Inquisitor Vance stood on a raised platform, her voice amplified by Voxcasters. You have been found guilty of various crimes against the Imperium: corruption, heresy, sedition, deviation from the Emperor's light. The sentences vary. Some of you will face execution, others penal servitude, others re-education. But before judgment is executed, you will serve one final purpose. She gestured, and servitors wheeled in equipment: portable cogitators, psychic resonance detectors, memory extraction devices that looked like medieval torture instruments reimagined by the Mechanicus. The Inquisition requires intelligence, through information about how corruption spreads, how heresy manifests, what psychological markers predict deviation. You will provide this data, your minds will be cataloged, your memories extracted, your patterns of thought analyzed and filed in archives that will help us identify future threats before they metastasize. It was worse than execution. They were going to strip away everything that made them human, every private thought, every cherished memory, every fragment of identity, and reduce them to data points in a research database. They would be vivisected psychically, their souls dissected for science, and then discarded like spent ammunition casings. The process began alphabetically. Kern watched as Grades was strapped to an extraction chair, watched the tech priest attach neural probes to his skull, watched the lieutenant's body convulse as machines pulled memories directly from his cortex. Grades screamed for 6 minutes before his mind broke entirely, leaving him a drooling vegetative shell that would be sent to a corpse starch processing facility because even broken bodies had caloric value. Hassan went next. Then an administratum clerk named Jevons. Then Yellen, who fought until they drugged him into compliance. One by one, Vance's subjects were processed, cataloged, destroyed. When they called Sarah's name, Kern finally broke his silence. "Please," he said, his voice cutting through the mechanical hum. "She's innocent. She's never done anything. You have her letters. They're just normal complaints. Tired worker talking about her life. There's no corruption there, no heresy, just human exhaustion." Vance turned to look at him. Her expression thoughtful. "You're right," she said. And for one desperate moment, Kern thought he'd reached her. "Your sister is almost certainly innocent of conscious heresy. Her psychological profile suggests standard citizen-grade fatigue and mild dissatisfaction with labor conditions. Nothing actionable under normal circumstances." Hope flared in Kern's chest. "But these aren't normal circumstances," Vance continued. "Your sister shares your genetic material. She was raised in the same environment, exposed to the same influences. If you carry markers of ideological corruption, and you do, then there's a statistical probability she carries them as well. Even if dormant, even if unexpressed, we cannot afford to assume genetic innocence when behavioral innocence is demonstrated." She nodded to the stormtroopers. They grabbed Sarah, Sauk, who started screaming, crying out Kern's name, begging him to help her, to save her, to make them stop. Kern lunged forward, Magna shackles holding him back, stormtroopers slamming rifle butts into his ribs until he collapsed. He watched from the floor as they strapped his sister to the extraction chair, watched her eyes, terrified and uncomprehending, find his one last time. "Davos, please!" she sobbed. "Please, I don't understand. I didn't do anything. Please." The tech priest activated the machine. Sarah's screams drowned out everything else. The sound of a mind being torn apart, memories extracted like teeth pulled without anesthetic, personality dissolved into component data that would be filed and forgotten. It lasted 9 minutes. When it was over, Sarah still breathed, but nothing that made her Sarah remained. Were it just meat and neural impulses, a biological shell waiting for corpse starch processing. Kern felt something inside himself die with her. Not his faith. That had eroded over 8 days of interrogation. Not his loyalty. That had crumbled during the tribunal. What died was his last connection to humanity. His last belief that the Imperium he'd served for 23 years was worth serving. When they called his name, Kern walked to the extraction chair without resistance. The tech priest worked with mechanical efficiency, attaching probes to Kern's temples, his spine, directly into his brainstem. Pain exploded through his nervous system as the machine activated, but pain was almost a relief after the psychological torture of the past days. His memories unspooled like thread from a spool. Childhood on Cadia, training at the Scola, first deployment, first kill, the faces of soldiers he'd commanded, both living and dead. The smile Elise had given him before she'd expressed her doubts. The letters from Sarah, Hassan's stupid Leo-stick scheme, Yellen's competence. The moment, that single, terrible moment, when he'd wondered if the Imperial tithe demanded too much. The machine took it all, categorized it, reduced his entire existence to data points that would help the Inquisition identify future deviants. His suffering would be used to justify more suffering, his memories weaponized against others who thought forbidden thoughts or felt forbidden doubts. But something unexpected happened as the extraction neared completion. As Kern's consciousness fragmented under the assault, as his sense of self dissolved into component pieces, he felt something else. A presence. Not demonic. He'd been scanned too many times, tested too thoroughly, but a presence nonetheless. A whisper in the static. The Imperium doesn't deserve your faith. It takes everything and gives nothing. It grinds souls to dust and calls it necessity. You served loyally, and it destroyed you anyway. The thought was his own. Or was it? In the ruins of his dying mind, Kern couldn't tell anymore. Couldn't separate his genuine despair from external influence. Couldn't determine if his growing hatred for the Imperium that had murdered his sister was righteous, or the first whisper of actual corruption. And that was the final horror. The Inquisition's methods, the torture, the invasion, the systematic destruction of everything he valued, had accomplished what no demon ever could. They'd broken him, made him hate, made him question whether the Emperor's light was worth following if it required this much darkness to maintain. In destroying corruption, they'd created it. The machine shut down. Kern slumped in the chair, his mind a shattered mosaic barely holding together. A tech priest checked readings, nodded to Vance. Extraction complete. Subject remains viable for secondary processing. Secondary processing. Servitor conversion. They would lobotomize what remained of his consciousness, install augmetics and control implants, turn him into a mindless drone that would serve the Imperium for decades until his biological components finally failed. It was, Vance would argue, mercy. He would continue to serve, would contribute to humanity's survival, would be useful. Kern knew better, knew that some fates were worse than death, and living as a hollow shell programmed to serve the system that had destroyed everything you loved was the worst fate of all. As stormtroopers unstrapped him from the chair and dragged him toward the servitor conversion bay, Kern's fragmenting mind clung to one final thought. The Inquisition believes it protects humanity from chaos. But what protection is there when the protectors are more terrible than the threat? He would never know the answer. In 6 hours, the surgery would be complete. Davos Kern would cease to exist as a thinking, feeling being. What remained would be Servitor Unit 7743K, assigned to ammunition loading on an Imperial Navy warship, performing the same task for the next 30 years, until mechanical failure or enemy fire finally granted the mercy of oblivion. The Emperor protects, the ecclesiarchy preached. But nobody protected you from the Emperor's servants. The servitor conversion bay was a temple of cold light and screaming saws. The air smelled of ozone, sterilizing chemicals, and the faint, copper-tinged scent of blood that the scrubbers couldn't quite eliminate. Davos Kern, or what was left of him, was strapped to a surgical slab of polished steel, his limbs locked in place by hydraulic clamps. Above him, multi-limbed servitors hung from the ceiling, their tools whirring. Bone saws, neural drills, injector needles the length of a man's forearm. A tech priest of the Adeptus Mechanicus, his face a porcelain mask beneath a crimson hood, intoned the litany of cleansing as he worked. The flesh is weak, but the machine is eternal. The mind is fallible, but the program is pure. We excise the corruption. We install the certainty. Kern's world had shrunk to a haze of chemical-induced paralysis and fragmented, screaming thought. He could not move. He could barely form a coherent idea, but he could feel the cold of the slab seeping into his back, the vibration of machinery through the metal, the terrifying absence where whole chunks of his memory had been ripped out by the Inquisition's extractor. The first cut was not to his body, but to his soul. A final, brutal psycho-conditioning barrage was administered. Flickering hololiths of the Emperor, the Inquisitorial Rosette, and screaming demons flashed before his eyes at dizzying speed, paired with agonizing neural feedback. The message was burned into the crumbling substrate of his consciousness. Service is absolution. Obedience is peace. Thought is heresy. It was the final hammer blow to his identity, shattering the last stubborn fragments of Davos Kern into dust. Then the physical work began. With a pneumatic hiss, a saw descended. There was pain, immense and electric, as his left arm was severed just below the shoulder. Then the right. His legs followed at the thighs. The medic servitors immediately cauterized the stumps with searing thermal prods, the smell of his own burning flesh filling Kern's nostrils. He could not scream. His vocal cords had been chemically muted. The agony was a silent, internal firestorm. Next came the drill. A delicate, whining instrument bore into the side of his skull. He felt pressure, then a terrible emptiness as sections of his frontal lobe and hippocampus were precisely vacuumed out. The seats of personal memory, initiative, and complex thought. In their place, the tech priest inserted the crystalline cogitator core and the obedience protocol neural shunt. Wires were threaded into his brainstem, linking what remained of his biological nervous system to the cold logic of the machine. As the augmetic limbs were riveted to his skeletal remains and the subdermal armor plates were fused to his torso, Davos Kern ceased to be. The being on the slab was now Servitor 7743K. Its purpose was already programmed: munitions loader, pattern Delta. It would lift, carry, and load shells of specific mass and dimension. It would respond to 7 binary command voices. It would perform its duty for 18.5 hours each day, then enter maintenance stasis. It would do this until its biological components failed. Inquisitor Vance observed the final phase from a viewing gallery. She watched as the crude, piston-driven arms were tested, lifting a dummy shell. She noted the clean, efficient movements. "A satisfactory conversion," she said to the tech priest. "The raw material was robust. It will serve well." She saw not a man she had broken, but a resource she had successfully salvaged from the wreckage of heresy. This was the Empire's mercy. The chance to be useful after your humanity had been declared a contaminant. Kern's body would serve on the front lines of the very system that had annihilated him, a perfect grim paradox. Section 7, the rust-bound hells, Penal Legion. Not all of Kern's platoon met the same fate. For some, like Private Yellen, execution or servitude was not deemed sufficient. Their guilt required a more exemplary form of penance, or they were granted the Emperor's mercy. Yellen and 11 others from the investigation were loaded onto a different ship, a rotting, cavernous troop carrier called the Sinner's Reprieve. They were stripped of their uniforms, given ragged gray fatigues stenciled with the lacrimae mortis, the tear of death, the mark of the Penal Legion. Their new world was a metal box in the ship's hold, crammed with hundreds of other damned men and women, murderers, thieves, rebels, and fools like them who had drawn the Inquisition's gaze. The air was thick with sweat, vomit, and despair. There were no guards inside the hold, only automated turrets in the ceiling. Attempted rebellion meant instant incineration. Their commissar was a brooding, cybernetically enhanced monster named Drog, a former enforcer who had himself fallen foul of the law. He preached only one sermon, daily, through a cracked Vox grill. "You are already dead. Your bodies belong to the Emperor. You will die where he points you, and your screams will be the hymns that buy forgiveness for your wretched souls." Their destination was the siege world of Fracture, where an orc wah was battering against the Imperial lines. The Penal Legion's purpose was not to win battles, but to consume them. They would be deployed first, in screaming waves of unarmed or poorly armed flesh. They would drown the enemy in their blood, soaking up bullets and artillery, revealing enemy positions, and wearing down the greenskins through sheer horrific attrition. Yellen understood now, in the feuated dark of the hold. His moment of doubt, excavated from the depths of his mind, had not just condemned him. It had purchased something. His suffering, and the suffering of every wretch around him, was a currency. Their lives were spent to conserve the lives of real guardsmen. Their deaths were a logistical calculation, a cheap buffer for more valuable Imperial assets. As the ship shuddered through the warp, Yellen clutched the rusty, single-shot las pistol he'd been issued. It was less a weapon and more a courtesy, a chance to choose a slightly faster death. He thought of his family, marked with the taint, their futures extinguished because of his private, long-forgotten thought. He thought of Kern. He wondered which of them had received the crueler sentence. The verdict had been death. The punishment was to become a statistic, a bloody smear on a battlefield no one would ever name, a number subtracted from the enemy's ammunition count. This was the fate of those the Inquisition deemed expendable, but illustrative. For a select few of the detained, those like Lieutenant Grades, whose warp taint was faint but confirmed, the journey was different. Grades, his mind a hollow ruin from the memory extraction, was not taken to a servitor bay or a penal hulk. He was loaded onto a vessel with black, sensor-absorbent hull plating and no visible markings, a black ship. These are the silent arcs of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, the soul traps of the Imperium. Within, the atmosphere was one of profound, choking silence, broken only by the hum of powerful Geller fields and the occasional muffled whimper. Grades was placed in a warded cell, alone, fed through a slot. He saw no one for days at a time. The psychic weight of thousands of other captive souls, unsanctioned psychers, the touched, the haunted, pressed down on the air, a static of silent terror. His trace taint was not enough for the Astronomicon. He would not fuel the Emperor's beacon. His fate was smaller, darker. He would be transported to a distant, secretive facility of the Inquisition's Ordo Malleus, the Demon Hunters. There, his psychic resonance, the very flaw that made him a risk, would be studied. He would be exposed to controlled warp phenomena. His reactions would be measured. His breaking point would be meticulously documented. He was no longer a soldier or even a prisoner. He was laboratory substrate. His eventual death, when it came, would not be a release. It would be a data point in a long experiment, his soul's extinction recorded on a data slate to help some future Inquisitor identify, combat, or even manipulate the ruinous powers. In the Imperium, even damnation could be reverse-engineered for utility. The investigation did not end with the purge of the platoon and their families. Inquisitor Vance's work had consequences that rippled out across the sector, like a stone dropped in a pond. On Verdant 3, the entire Cadian 8th Reserve Regiment was subject to a devotion audit. 2 more officers were executed for moral laxity. daily mandatory prayer sessions were increased by 3 hours. The regiment's next deployment was to a high-casualty war zone, a chance to bleed out the potential corruption in the fires of faith. On Cadia, in the Hab block where Sarah Kern had lived, a palpable fear took root. Neighbors who had testified or were interviewed were marked as adjacent to contamination. Their job prospects vanished. Their children were passed over for Skolem placements. The community learned a visceral lesson. Association with suspicion was itself a crime. The fear of the Inquisition became a more effective tool of control than any Arbeitspatrol. Vance herself compiled her report, a dense tome of analysis. The Kern contagion model would be cited in future inquisitorial training. It outlined the progressive decay model of heresy, demonstrating how petty fraud could be the visible symptom of deep systemic ideological rot. The fates of Kern, Yalen, Grades, and Sarah were reduced to illustrative case studies, Appendix Gamma through Epsilon. The system had not just punished individuals, it had reinforced its own terrifying logic. It had demonstrated its infinite reach and its zero-tolerance calculus. It had turned living, breathing, flawed humans into object lessons. The message was received across the subsector. No one is innocent. Everyone is being watched. Your doubt is a seed. Your silence is a prayer. Your life is a ledger entry awaiting its final sum. 10 standard years later, on the heavy cruiser Righteous Fury, a brutish, metal-armed servitor designated 7743K performed its duty. It stood in the roaring, deafening belly of a macro cannon battery, its piston-driven limbs lifting a 2-ton shell from a conveyor and slamming it into the loading cradle with metronomic precision. The ship trembled from the firing of other batteries. The air was acrid with propellant fumes. Teams of human loaders worked nearby, their shouts barely audible. They avoided looking at the servitor. It was a thing, a machine. They did not wonder about its past. They did not see the faded, scarred tissue on its torso where Imperial eagles had once been tattooed. They did not notice the faint, rhythmic twitch in its one remaining organic eye, a meaningless neurological ghost, a fragment of a system that had once been a man. In that eye, reflected in the polished brass of the loading cradle, the lights of the gun deck strobed. For a nanosecond, a cascade of misfiring synapses, a ghost in the shattered machine, created a phantom sensation. Not a memory, those were gone, but an echo of a feeling. The cold dread of a Valkyrie's shadow, the desperate hope in a sister's eyes, the crushing weight of absolute, inescapable authority. Then, a binary command pulse from the gun chief's console. Servitor 7743K turned with a hydraulic whine, grasped another shell, and repeated its task. The moment, if it ever was gone. This is the final silent truth of an inquisitorial investigation. It does not end with a bang, or a scream, or a burning pyre. It ends in the quiet, efficient hum of the machine. The suspect is erased. The evidence is filed. The lesson is absorbed. The Imperium grinds on, its survival paid for in the currency of shattered souls. The guilty and the innocent alike are consumed, processed, and repurposed, until nothing remains but the flawless, merciless function of the Empire they died, or were destroyed, to preserve. The Emperor protects. But his protection is a furnace, and we are all fuel. Thought for the day. Innocence proves nothing.
Thank you for watching this episode of 40K Galaxy. If you want more grimdark tales, epic battles, and terrifying adventures from the Warhammer 40K universe, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share with your fellow warriors. Remember, in the galaxy of endless war, vigilance is key, and the Emperor protects. Until next time, keep your bolters ready and your faith unbroken.